20 dangerous women. Only one died rich, in her own bed, avenged. And only one met an end so brutal that 2,000 people stopped to watch. Among them, one whom death never found on paper, one buried under a false name, and one killed by her own husband. The closer you get to number one, the worse it gets. And the ending? No one sees it coming. Number 20, Susan McSween, the cattle queen who died rich, old, and avenged. On a list where almost everyone ends up in the mud or full of lead, she's the exception. And that's why she opens the ranking. Susan McSween was married to Alexander McSween, the lawyer who stood up to the most dangerous monopoly in New Mexico during the Lincoln County War. In July 1878, after a 5-day siege, gunmen set her house in Lincoln on fire and killed her husband in the yard. She walked through the flames on foot, unarmed and without an escort. In the middle of that gunfight was a young man named Billy the Kid. He escaped out the back. Her husband didn't. Any widow would have run. She stayed, sued the powerful men in court, bought land, and built a cattle empire in 3 rivers, thousands of head of cattle and the title of Cattle Queen of New Mexico. She died on January 3, 1931, in White Oaks, New Mexico, at the age of 85, in her own bed, rich and respected, decades after the men who burned down her house had ended up in shallow graves. The irony is cold. The gunmen became footnotes, and the woman who walked out of the fire became a queen. Number 19, Lottie Dino. In the Texas saloons of the 1870s, this mysterious redhead cleaned out gunfighters, soldiers, and buffalo hunters at the faro tables of Fort Griffin, one of the most violent places on the frontier. And they say even Doc Holliday lost money to her. Then, one day, she simply vanished, leaving nothing but a note on her room door, and no one in Texas ever heard from her again. She had secretly married gambler Frank Thurmond and started over from scratch in Deming, New Mexico, becoming a respectable wife, businesswoman, and founding member of the town's Episcopal Church. That was where she died peacefully on February 9, 1934, at the age of 89, buried under the name Charlotte Thurmond, surrounded by neighbors who knew her only as a pillar of the community. At the funeral, everyone mourned the old church lady, and no one there had any idea they were saying goodbye to the most legendary female gambler of the Old West, the woman who would later inspire Miss Kitty from Gunsmoke. In the end, Texas's greatest bluffer won the toughest bet of all. She sat at the table with her own past for half a century, and no one ever saw her cards. At number 18, Big Nose Kate, the woman who outlived an entire era. Born Mary Catherine Horany in Hungary, she crossed the West alongside Doc Holliday, one of the most feared gunfighters on the frontier, and she never backed down from anyone. In 1877, in Fort Griffin, Texas, when Doc was arrested for murder, Kate didn't cry or beg. She set a hotel on fire to distract the town and broke him out of jail at gunpoint. She spent years living that hard life, following the gambling and the dust from town to town, and watched, one by one, every man from that era fall before she did. But here's the detail almost nobody tells you. Death never came looking for her. Kate died on November 2, 1940, at the age of 89, just days before turning 90, in a clean bed at the Arizona Pioneers Home in Prescott, supported by the same state that once wanted to see her behind bars. The woman who set a hotel on fire for love outlasted Doc, outlasted the Earps, outlasted the Old West itself. In the end, one of the frontier's most dangerous pasts quietly faded away in a government-paid room, and almost no one there knew who she had been. Number 17, Laura Bullion. She was the Rose of the Wild Bunch, the only woman arrested alongside Butch Cassidy's gang, and the only one who managed to disappear on her own terms. The daughter of a robber, she grew up in Texas and joined the gang while still young, dating two of the most wanted men in the country. Will Carver, and Ben Kilpatrick, the tall Texan. In 1901, she was arrested in St. Louis, carrying $8,500 in stolen bills from the Great Northern train robbery in Montana. Sentenced to 5 years, she served 3.5 and, once released, did what none of her partners managed to do. She vanished. She moved to Memphis, became Frida Bullion Lincoln, told her neighbors she was a war widow, and spent decades working as a seamstress and interior decorator. She died on December 2, 1961, from a heart condition in a Memphis hospital at the age of 85. In bed, peacefully, the last surviving member of the Wild Bunch, with the gentlest death an outlaw could ever dream of. On her headstone at Memorial Park Cemetery, it simply says, Frida Bullion Lincoln, relative of the Thorntons. The woman who helped rob trains was buried without anyone knowing who was actually being laid to rest. Number 16. Rose Dunn, the Rose of Cimarron. Of all the women on this list, she's the only one who loved Oklahoma's most wanted outlaw and died of old age in her own bed. As a teenager, she fell in love with George Bittercreek Newcomb, a gunman from the Doolin gang with a $5,000 bounty on his head, dead or alive. On September 1, 1893, in the town of Ingalls, federal marshals surrounded the gang. It's said that Rose crossed through the gunfire carrying a rifle and ammunition to the wounded Newcomb, while 3 lawmen died in the street. He escaped that day. But in 1895 came the twist. When Newcomb returned to the Dunn farm to see her, it was Rose's own brothers, now bounty hunters, who shot him dead at the door and collected the reward for the man she loved. Rose was never charged with any crime. She married a local politician, lived a quiet life, and died on June 11, 1955, in Salcombe, Washington, at the age of 76. She made it through the crossfire at Ingalls without a scratch, and made it through history the same way, untouched, while every man around her fell, one by one. Number 15. Cattle Annie. Anna Emmeline McDoulet was only 15 when newspapers in Oklahoma Territory were already calling her an outlaw. She and her friend Little Britches sold illegal whiskey to Native Americans and stole horses for the feared Bill Doolin gang. Her life was always on the run. She slept out in the open, carried a gun, and warned the outlaws whenever deputies were getting close. In August 1895, Marshals Bill Tilghman and Steve Burke surrounded the two near Pawnee. Annie jumped out a window shooting, but was overpowered in the yard. The judge sent her to serve time at the Women's Reformatory in Framingham, Massachusetts, more than 2,000 miles from home. And that was where her outlaw career ended for good. Released early for good behavior, she returned to Oklahoma, married twice, became a regular churchgoer, and worked as a bookkeeper, never talking about her past. She died on November 7, 1978, in Oklahoma City at the age of 95 of natural causes, in a hospital bed. The territory's most wanted teenage girl lived long enough to outlive every lawman who had once hunted her. Number 14. Etta Place. She was the only woman who rode with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid's Wild Bunch, and Pinkerton, the biggest detective agency in the country, never even figured out her real name. Beautiful, educated, good with a rifle and in the saddle, she fled to Argentina in 1901 with Sundance, lived on a ranch in Patagonia, and returned to the United States when the law started closing in. And this is where the story hits a wall. The last reliable record places Etta in San Francisco around 1906. Some say she showed up again in 1907, heading back to South America. After that, complete silence. No death certificate, no grave, no date, no witness. Pinkerton detectives followed leads for years: a school teacher in Texas, a boarding house owner, even a woman who supposedly requested Sundance's death certificate in 1930, and none of them checked out. Her file was never officially closed. The irony is cold. On a list where every woman is defined by her own death, Etta Place is the only one death never found on paper. She beat the one pursuer no one escapes, the official record. Number 13, Pearl Hart. She became known as the woman who pulled off one of the last stagecoach robberies in Old West history, and then simply disappeared. Born in Canada around 1871, Pearl made her way to Arizona after fleeing an abusive marriage and drowning in debt. On May 30th, 1899, near Globe, she and her partner Joe Boot stopped a stagecoach and took about $430 from the passengers. Arrested days later, she became a national celebrity. Newspapers across the country fought over the story of the stagecoach bandit. She served time in the notorious Yuma prison and was paroled in 1902. And here's the detail that still puzzles historians today. After a brief stint on stage, Pearl vanished off the map. It's believed she remarried, took another name, and lived quietly for decades on a ranch in Arizona. She died around 1955, probably in Dripping Springs, Arizona, but records even disagree on the exact year of her death. The woman the newspapers turned into a legend chose the ending no one expected: complete anonymity. But make no mistake, from here on out, the endings only get more brutal. Number 12, D'Arteste. The woman the United States Army couldn't kill, not with bullets, not with disease, not with 27 years of imprisonment. She was the woman Geronimo sent when he needed to talk to the U.S. Army, fluent in English, a better shot than many men, and riding with the last free Apaches. She helped negotiate Geronimo's final surrender in September 1886. And what was her reward? A train ride to prison, along with all the Chiricahuas. At Fort Marion in Florida, she came down with tuberculosis and pneumonia, the diseases that killed hundreds of her people, including her fellow warrior Lozin. She survived both. Her captivity took her through Florida, Alabama, and Fort Sill in Oklahoma, until freedom finally came in 1913. She chose the Mescalero Reservation in New Mexico and refused to speak English for the rest of her life, the same language she had once used to serve as a bridge between two worlds. She died in 1955 of old age, at around 95, on the reservation itself. The government spent nearly 3 decades trying to break her with prison and disease. She outlived everyone who signed those papers. Number 11, Calamity Jane. This woman rode as an Army scout, crossed hostile territory dressed as a man, and survived everything the Old West threw at her, except the bottle. Martha Jane Canary had a good side. In 1878, when smallpox swept through Deadwood, she was the one who cared for the sick everyone else had abandoned. But in her final years, the legend became a sideshow attraction, wandering from town to town, selling pictures of herself to pay for whiskey, getting kicked out of shows for showing up drunk. She used to say she wanted to be buried next to Wild Bill Hickok, the man she swore she had loved, and fate took that request seriously. On August 1, 1903, at the age of 51, she died of pneumonia in a hotel room in Terry, South Dakota, just a few miles from Deadwood, the town that made her famous. The funeral procession was one of the largest Deadwood had ever seen, and she got her place in Mount Moriah Cemetery, right next to Bill. The irony is that, according to longtime residents of the town, Hickok could barely stand having her around while he was alive. And some swore that burying her there was Deadwood's final joke at the old gunfighter's expense. Number 10, Mary Fields. At 60 years old, Stagecoach Mary carried a .38 revolver under her apron, and no man in Montana dared to test her. Born into slavery in Tennessee around 1832, she became the first black woman to deliver mail for the United States government in 1895, covering frozen routes where stagecoaches couldn't reach. One winter night, when wolves overturned her wagon, she stood guard alone until dawn, rifle in hand, and the cargo arrived intact. She was the only woman allowed by the mayor to drink in the saloons of Cascade, sitting among men she respected and who respected her. She beat blizzards, highway robbers, and the prejudice of an entire era without taking a scratch. But on December 5, 1914, at Columbus Hospital in Great Falls, Montana, her liver stopped working. Liver failure, a slow death, in a bed, with no enemy in sight. The woman no bullet could touch was brought down by the one thing she could never face head-on: her own body. On the day of her burial, Cascade shut down its businesses, and the funeral was one of the largest that town had ever seen. Number 9. Sarah Winnemucca. This woman did something no other Native woman had done. She took on the United States government using their own language and wrote a book to prove it. The granddaughter of a Paiute chief, she spoke 5 languages and worked as an interpreter and army scout, riding alone on horseback through hostile territory to rescue her own father from an enemy camp. In the 1880s, she gave more than 300 lectures across the country, exposing corrupt reservation agents, shook hands with a president, and in 1883 published the first book written by a Native American woman in America. She got promises from Washington in writing. Not a single one was kept. Tired and sick, she withdrew to her sister's home in Henry's Lake, Idaho, where she died suddenly on October 16, 1891, at the age of 47, probably from tuberculosis, the same disease devastating her people on the reservations she had spent her life speaking out against. The woman who challenged the government for 20 years was silenced not by a bullet, but by the disease the system itself had spread. Washington never had to answer her. It only had to wait. Number 8. Mochi. She went down in history as the only Native American woman the United States Army imprisoned as a prisoner of war. Her path began in November 1864 at the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado, when soldiers killed her mother and her husband right in front of her. That day, Mochi picked up a rifle and spent the next 10 years fighting alongside Cheyenne warriors. In September 1874, she took part in the attack on the German family in Kansas, and that was the incident the government never forgave. Captured in 1875, she was sent in chains to Fort Marion, a damp stone fortress in St. Augustine, Florida, more than 2,000 miles from the plains where she grew up, and she was locked up there for 3 years. It was inside those closed walls and that heavy air that tuberculosis entered her body. Released in 1878, she returned to Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma, but she brought the disease back with her. She died in 1881, close to the age of 40, lying in a bed instead of on a battlefield. The Army never managed to defeat her with bullets. Fort Marion did the job quietly, 3 years later. Number 7. Loson, the warrior the U.S. Army could never capture in battle, despite more than a decade of chasing her. The sister of Chief Victorio of the Chihenne Apache people, she rode alongside Geronimo in the last armed resistance of the West, and the Apaches themselves swore she could sense the enemy's position before any scout spotted them. In one of her most famous escapes, she crossed the Rio Grande on horseback under fire, guiding women and children to the safety of the opposite bank, while the soldiers were left behind. But when Geronimo surrendered in 1886, Loson went with him, and the government shipped the prisoners across the country, first to Florida, then to Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama, a damp military post where tuberculosis spread from tent to tent. That was where she died on June 17, 1889, more than 2,000 miles from the mountains where she was born, buried in an unmarked grave. The woman who escaped thousands of armed soldiers was brought down by an enemy no one could see. The Army didn't defeat her on the battlefield. It had to lock her up in a place where not even she could escape the disease. Number 6. Eleanor Dumont, Madame Moustache, the first woman to run a blackjack table in the Old West, and for 2 decades almost no man walked away a winner from her table. She arrived in Nevada City in 1854 with a French accent and opened her own gambling house in a world where women were only allowed in through the back door. But time took its toll. The gold fields dried up, a con man husband named Jack McKnight disappeared with her money, and the dark mustache that earned her nickname became a joke in the saloons. She followed the mining camps from town to town, getting poorer each time, until she ended up in Bodie, California, one of the most violent towns on the frontier. On the night of September 7th, 1879, she lost everything she had at the table, including borrowed money. The next morning, September 8th, her body was found about a mile outside town, next to an empty bottle of morphine. The local newspaper summed it all up in 3 words: tired of life. And no one ever knew whether it was an accident or a decision. The woman who spent 25 years calculating everyone else's odds ended up in the one bet where the house always wins. Number 5, Kitty Leroy. She was Deadwood's most dangerous dancer, a woman who hid revolvers under her dress and knives at her waist. Kitty started dancing in Texas saloons when she was still young and became famous for shooting as well as any gunfighter. They say she could hit apples balanced on volunteers' heads. In 1876, she arrived in Deadwood, Dakota Territory, right in the middle of the gold rush, and opened her own gambling house, the Mint, where she took miners' gold at the poker table, sometimes dressed as a man so she would be taken seriously. She married 5 times, and they say she changed husbands the way someone throws away bad cards at the table. On the night of December 6, 1877, her 5th husband, Sam Curley, went up to her room at the Lone Star Saloon, pulled his revolver, and shot her at point-blank range. Then he turned the gun on himself. Their 2 bodies were laid out side by side in the same room where they fell, while the entire town filed past to see the scene. The woman who made a living betting against everyone lost the one bet she never chose: the man who carried her name. Number 4, Dora Hand. In Dodge City, no one was more beloved than Dora Hand. She sang in church in the morning and in saloons at night in the most dangerous town in Kansas. In October 1878, she was sleeping at the home of Mayor James Kelly, who had gone away for health treatment and lent the room to the singers. In the early hours of the 4th, James Kennedy, the son of one of the richest cattlemen in Texas, rode up to the house and fired twice through the thin wall, trying to kill the mayor, whom he had fought with days earlier. The first bullet stopped in the floor, the second tore through 2 rooms and hit Dora in the right side, killing her in her sleep. The manhunt that went after him brought together what may have been the deadliest posse in Old West history: Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, Charlie Bassett, and Bill Tillman. They caught up with Kennedy 2 days later. Bat Masterson knocked him off his horse with a shot to the shoulder that left him crippled for the rest of his life. His father's money got him out of court, but it couldn't undo the damage. He killed the one person all of Dodge City loved and died just a few years later, still marked by Masterson's bullet. Number 3, Belle Starr. She was called the Queen of the Bandits, the woman who rode alongside Jesse James's gang and was convicted of horse theft by the feared Judge Isaac Parker, the hanging judge. She spent her life surrounded by outlaws: 2 husbands shot dead, a ranch called Younger's Bend that served as a hideout for wanted criminals, and a list of enemies that grew every year. On February 3, 1889, 2 days before her 41st birthday, she was riding home alone on a road near Eufaula, in Indian Territory, when someone hiding behind a fence shot her in the back with a shotgun. The first blast knocked her out of the saddle. The second, loaded with birdshot, hit her face and shoulder while she lay in the mud. The killer was never identified, but the main suspects were a neighbor named Edgar Watson, who had a land dispute with her, and her own son, Eddie Reed, whom she had argued with days earlier. The woman who survived all the gunfighters of the West died alone on an empty road, and no one was ever held accountable for it. Number 2. Cattle Kate, the only woman hanged in Wyoming history. Her real name was Ellen Watson. She was 29 years old, and she was never convicted of stealing a single cow. But she died branded as a cattle thief. An immigrant from Canada, she worked as a cook, saved up money, bought land under the Homestead Act, and registered her own cattle brand in the Sweetwater River Valley. The problem was that her land had water, and the cattle barons in the area wanted that water. On July 20th, 1889, 6 ranchers led by Albert Bothwell dragged Ellen from her home, along with her partner, Jim Averill, took them to a canyon and hanged them from a tree. No trial, no judge, no trapdoor, no drop to break their necks. The two slowly strangled to death. Afterward, newspapers controlled by the big cattlemen created the legend of Cattle Kate, the dangerous cattle thief, to justify the crime. The witnesses to the lynching disappeared or died one by one before the jury could meet, and not one of the 6 killers spent a single day in jail. And Albert Bothwell? He added Ellen's land to his ranch. Exactly what he had wanted all along. Number 1, the darkest of them all, Juanita of Downieville. She was the only woman hanged in California history, and it all happened in less than 24 hours. Josefa Segovia, known as Juanita, lived in the mining camp of Downieville during the height of the gold rush. In the early hours of July 5, 1851, right after the Independence Day celebrations, a miner named Fred Cannon broke down the door to her home. Hours later, he came back to insult her, and Juanita drove a knife into his chest. The crowd put together a makeshift trial that same morning. A doctor said she might be pregnant, and the crowd ran the doctor out of town. That same afternoon, they took Juanita to the bridge over the Yuba River. She didn't cry or beg. She climbed up on her own, adjusted the rope around her own neck, and said she would do it all over again. Witnesses said around 2,000 people watched from the riverbank. The irony is cold. Thousands of men killed for gold in those mountains and died of old age in their beds. The only person that camp decided to hang was a woman defending her own home.